Robert Rowland Smith. Hi there.
Hello, Mark. Very good to see you, and welcome to the people as they begin to join us for our Philosophy Slam.
This is a chance for people to write things in the chat, and then Robert and I riff on them philosophically, but quite a lot of psychology, often a bit of spiritual insight, even verging into the strange and perhaps on occasion supernatural. It's kind of that time of year, Robert. I'm feeling it a bit this evening. The eve of St. Nicholas, we are speaking.
Actually, Mark, I think that's less to do with the time of year than with your increasingly esoteric interests. Every time we meet, there's some strange new territory that you've breached. It was UFO. We can't call them UFOs anymore. I can't remember what I was supposed to call them, but UFOs. We talked about. We've had ghosts, obviously, recently, but yeah, I definitely think that you're getting into the weird and wonderful more and more these days.
It's I think it's UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena. And maybe it's because I'm becoming a bit of an OAP myself. Not quite, but it's that time of my life. I feel like, the edges are beginning to show, shall we say, and that makes me wonder about other kinds of edges too.
Yeah, well, indeed. It's going to be my 60th birthday in actually not next year, the year after. So I think I'm slightly ahead of you on those on the aging front. So
only just.
Yeah, could be worse.
But I wonder if it is a bit. It's a bit in our times. I think. Often when people feel crisis, they feel threat. The future, in a material sense, seems to have disappeared. Or at least, it'll keep going, but the promise isn't there as perhaps it was. Even in our lifetimes, 30 years ago, say, people could live for a better material tomorrow. It makes people look elsewhere, I think. And I certainly feel that, is part of what we're in now, a time that has become mistaken about really where life and its promise falls. And with actual crises, the fear that generates, it makes people look elsewhere. But perhaps, that's for the good.
Yeah, maybe you're right. Now, I notice a few people have begun to join us now, so I'm just going to remind everybody who's coming online how this works. So yeah, welcome to Philosophy Slam, if you're just joining. I'm Robert, and that's Mark on the other side of the screen.
On the other side, as we were just saying.
The other side, in every sense. We'll be online live for up to an hour, no more than an hour. And in that time, the idea is that you generate the words for Mark and me to improvise on. So if you can use the chat function, and you write in the chat function a single word. Now, this is Philosophy Slam. We do get serious words, but we also get incredibly trivial words. So we often get asked, recently, Mark, we've been asked AI quite a few times, and death comes up quite a lot. Narcissism, funnily enough, comes up a lot. Maybe that's because of you and me, sort of something we project. But we also get very silly things being asked of us as well. So what have we had recently?
Banana. I believe we had banana quite recently.
A banana. We had sausage, actually.
Sausage. Maybe I'm getting confused between my bananas and my sausages.
Yeah, all right. And go there just now. And what else have we had? Denim we've had as well. So the word can be heavy, it can be light, it can be serious, it can be playful. But it's really over to you guys then. So we're looking into the chat function now for the first word or words to pop up.
We did have one actually, Robert. Did you see that? Tom kindly put in ritual, which is a good one. And
right.
Miri has now put in planet as well. So we've got two to get us going. Shall I lift off with ritual?
You lift off with ritual. I think planet's going to be connected somehow, but you start with ritual.
What that makes me think is how rituals can be a form of knowledge. I'm rather interested in this. They're often talked about in a sociological context, as if rituals bond and bind people together. But I was fairly recently involved in a project looking at human origins, and it was trying to revive a notion originally associated with Durkheim, I think, that actually what really got Homo sapiens going, although no doubt Homo neanderthalis and heidelbergensis and others had this in some measure as well, was the capacity to use ritual to explore the world. And this was much to do with inner life as much as external life. But through ritual, maybe the coming together of many people, shifts of consciousness that occurs, but even the kind of thing that shows up through the regular repeating pattern. That's what we were focusing on as something that Homo sapiens became immensely able with, and so achieved a bit of liftoff for us in terms of the sapiens, the wisdom side of being human, and coupled to language and other things as well. But I feel now that part of the reason why people are interested in rituals again, whether it be rituals like going on pilgrimage, rituals around lighting candles, in the psychedelic world, it's very ritualized often, is because there's a sense that purely rational approaches to awareness, to the world around us, we've sort of exhausted them in a way. It's like we're missing something, purely by using rationalistic approaches, and rituals must be part of that. There's something more primitive, more basic, I think, that appeals to the soul as much as to the mind. So I'm rather fond of rituals myself.
I'm fond of rituals too, and I'm not sure if this is 100% true, but I think it's the case that nearly all rituals have an element of repetition about them. In other words, you don't think you ever really do a ritual once. One of the things that makes a ritual, I think, is that it's repeated. At least I can't think of a one-off ritual. Obviously, but a funeral is a one-off ritual because people only die once. But the ritual of a funeral is something we repeat in a pretty similar format. When people do die. And that makes me think, and I think maybe connecting to your point there, Mark, about it linking us to something higher or more soulful. I think one of the things that does is that rituals have a momentum, a cyclicality, a force to them, which, although we've set them up because they're human rituals, takes on a kind of momentum of its own. So, when Christmas comes around, or Thanksgiving, as we've just had, or a birthday comes around, often on an annual cycle, not always, springtime rituals, autumn rituals, we kind of just have to yield to them because the turning of the year is bigger than we are. They are connected, I think, very often to the cycles of the year and indeed the planet, which is one of the other words that came up. And I think that notion of surrender is important, both because when it comes around, when it happens, we all kind of obey, those of us that participate. And the ritual itself has a set formula or series of steps or mechanisms that we adhere to. Okay, and we may get them wrong occasionally. We might say the name wrong, like in that 4 Weddings and a Funeral. I was thinking of wedding rituals where people get the name slightly wrong, as Princess Diana did actually when she married Charles. If you remember, she got his name the wrong way around. But nevertheless, the ritual has these 2 levels of sort of necessity almost that command us. One is when it comes around. Now it's that time of year to obey it. And then the form of the ritual itself. And I think that is one of the things that it removes a bit of our ego, or it removes a bit of self-determinism at least. And I think, to your point about the soul being engaged, I think that's one of the preconditions for the soul to come into play, really. It's like if we get move the ego out of the way, it's almost like a vacuum. The soul rushes to fill the empty space.
I like that. That appeals to me somehow. It calls to my soul. So yeah. I like that. Hey, look, planet was mentioned as well. Maybe just say a little bit more about that, because I was thinking about a comment that William Blake was supposed to have made one day when he was in the habit, particularly in the early part of his life, of rather shocking people with his phrases and opinions. And the story goes that one day he was chatting to somebody, and he said to this person, the planet is quite flat, a sort of flat earther, seemingly. And the other person responded and says, what do you mean? It's been circumnavigated, as it had in the 18th century for a couple of centuries actually already. But it made me think, what did Blake mean by saying the planet is flat, you know. And I think what he was onto was how we experience the world in which we live. You know, even when we call it a world or call it a planet or call it Earth, um, he wanted us not just to appreciate our place in the cosmos as Newtonian science was beginning to unfold. You know, from Galileo had come the understanding that yes, it could be made to stack up the possibility that the Earth wasn't the center, that the sun was at the center, and then gradually it became clear that there was no center, and so the Earth and the sun was a system moving through, as we now know, a sort of vast reach of space. And Blake was onto the ramifications of that. And the trouble is that if we think of the planet as just one planet, probably amongst now, you know, millions, billions even, nowhere special, then that loosens our sense of connection with it. You know, you might get anxious because you realize, gosh, this is our island home, we've got to look after it. But in terms of experiencing it, we do experience it as a flat Earth. And that's why we love the sunrise, because although we know that the sun doesn't rise, it still feels like that when it shows up in the morning. And although the sun isn't a beautiful sapphire dome overhead, that's how we experience it. And so I think Blake was onto something when he, no doubt slightly tongue-in-cheek, seemed to come out as a flat earther. He wasn't actually going against the science per se, but what he was saying is that, look, we can experience the planet in ways more than a strictly scientific account would allow.
That's great, Mark. I like that. I'm struck by the fact that the planets play a part of our life, and whether or not you believe in astrology, for example, that actually inadvertently, surreptitiously, we're still working with the planets literally every day of the week, because the days of the week are named after them. And we kind of, I think it's easy to forget this. I mean, so today's it's Tuesday, isn't it? Still, no, it's been a long day. Which is in English, it's a bit masked. But if you know in French, for example, mardi, lundi, mardi is the day of Mars, obviously. So today is the day of Mars. Tomorrow, Wednesday, mercredi in French, Mercury, and so on. Vendredi, you know, jeudi, vendredi, we've got Jove, and then we go on to Venus, and obviously Saturn and the Sun on Sunday. So it's interesting to me that the days themselves have this kind of planetary marker on, you know, written into themselves, that we kind of unconsciously are reminded of in everyday life. I think it's kind of marvelous that we have that, actually.
Yeah, when I was writing about Dante in the Divine Comedy, and the Paradiso is structured around those planetary, well, not days of the week, but planetary spheres. You know, it struck people as very striking that there were 7 planets in the sky, and somehow the rhythm of 7 days made sense to the human soul as well. And what I took Dante to be driving at is that different planets do have different qualities associated with them. The quality of their light. I mean, you mentioned Mardi, Tuesday today. You know, the warrior god, and of course, you know, Mars is very strikingly red when you see it in the sky. And so that quality of light stirs a response in us, influences us, you know, inflows into us. And so I think Dante was onto how, by paying attention to different qualities of light, different facets of ourselves wake up. And you feel that during the course of the week. Still, it makes sense. It's much shaped by work now. But tell me why I don't like Mondays. We all know what that means. You know, we love Friday night. Saturday feels relaxing. Time stands still. Of course, Saturn is associated with time standing still. So there's still quite powerful echoes of the old ways, even if you don't quite sign up to the full astrology, as you say.
Now, let's move on. We had a word put in. I'm not sure if I read it correctly or I don't recognize the word, but the word is exaptations, I think, Rosie put in. I'm not sure if that's my mistake or not. Let's come back to that, or maybe try and riff on a word that neither Mark nor I actually know anything about, and see if we can inject some meaning into it. But the other one I've seen come up is the word sophia. And just to remind people, if you're coming onto the call recently, the idea of the Philosophy Slam is that you type any word in the chat function, and then Mark and I will attempt to say something incredibly wise about it. So we've had ritual and planet so far, possibly exaptations. It's a new one on me. But I want to say something about sophia, because of course, and we've got another one that's just come up, which is holy wisdom, obviously connected to Sophia. Sophia, for those of you who are philosophers like me and Mark, will know that Sophia itself means wisdom. So philosophy is the love of wisdom. And it's made me think recently, so I've got a friend, Andrew Scott is his name, who's an expert on longevity and the fact that we're all living much longer lives these days, about the link between life experience and wisdom, because we tend to think they kind of go together, that, as you get older, you become wiser. I'm not sure it's entirely true in my case, but we do sort of have that notion that wisdom is predicated, or is a kind of combination, I suppose, of insight and experience, that it's hard to be wise when you're young. And yet I've got something a bit contrary to say about that. And in fact, I think this would fit with William Blake, perhaps, although I'm venturing onto ground that is much more yours, Mark, than mine. The idea of the wise child. Now, we do talk about children sometimes being wise beyond their years. And I think that's partly because sometimes children have access, or haven't yet become kind of gummed up with the sediments of self-defense and cynicism and all the things that we as adults do in order to protect ourselves. And so the faculty of, let's say, at least intuition is sometimes more to the fore than it is for grown-ups. Now, whether intuition is the same as wisdom, I'm not exactly sure. And we've got our definition of exaptation: performs a function not produced by by natural selection.
I had a quick Google. It's a Darwinian term, so I could pick that one up. But
it's connected then to adaptation, presumably, so exaptation. So thank you for that. But just to finish on this notion of Sophia and wisdom, I like the idea that actually there is a wisdom in children sometimes, which is perhaps more connected to the intuitive faculties than it is the kind of build-up of seasoned experience, where over time we learn to judge things carefully. So it's interesting to me that the two can be sort of brought together, or whether there is a difference between wisdom and intuition. I mean, that Blake certainly had some things to say, didn't he, about the wisdom of children?
Yeah, very much. Innocence is his word. And by innocence, he doesn't mean naivety, because it becomes very clear if you read his songs of innocence, later wrapped up with songs of innocence and experience, that innocence itself faces great dangers, knows sadness, takes risks. But what Blake was onto was the notion that there can be a kind of innocence that's not naivety, but is a capacity to say yes to life, even when you know that it could be difficult or dangerous. And that's what the child is able to do. And the child, maybe not knowing better, maybe beginning to know better, but still full of curiosity and energy and so on. That kind of innocence, which is very appealing. And I think, in a lot of wisdom traditions, you get this notion of, I don't know, beginner's mind, as it's sometimes put in Buddhist circles, or Jesus is said to have told the disciples to suffer the little children because the kingdom of God belongs to them. And I think it's that kind of openness, that porousness. And, sometimes, there's also the phrase out of the mouths of babes and sucklings, which maybe goes to your point that a kind of wisdom can emerge from that innocence, because it's not defended, it's not guarded, it's not sort of weighed down by the niceties of adult life. And so it can be really refreshing and wonderful. And so keeping, Blake thought, that innocence alive is key to wisdom.
Yeah, that's great, Mark. I like that. And we'll come on to this exaptation thing. Now, of course, it's Mark and I just secretly Googling, what it means. And it's obviously connected to adaptation in Darwin. I just want to say, I know you got things to say about it, Mark, but I was watching yesterday this latest David Attenborough series, Planet Earth, and maybe this is connected to exaptation, if I've understood. But it struck me that wonderful, beautiful, enthralling, educational, aesthetic, profound as those series are by David Attenborough and others, they are still the kind of underlying intellectual framework behind them is a Darwinian one. I mean, so many of the shots are to do with survival, essentially. So much of the narrative is to do with how does this creature survive, either by adapting to a new habitat, by killing other creatures, or by reproducing. And those seem to be the three kind of dominant tropes, you know, the look for habit, the search for habitat, the search for food, and the search for a mate, essentially. Those seem to be again and again sort of reinforced. And the reason why I say that still belongs to a kind of Darwinian model is that it allows very little room for things other than those aspects of animal life, that they are things that they are not adapted for, but things that they might be indeed exapted for, if we can use it like that, which is all the stuff that is much less functional in animal and indeed human life. You know, social function, for example, social interaction, apparently meaningless exchanges, play, things which lie beyond immediate sort of functional or instrumental use. And I mean, you do occasionally get, you know, stuff in those programs about, you know, the social interactions of animals, but it's very much a kind of add-on to that very dominant sort of Darwinian take on things. So I don't know if that fits with this notion of exaptation, but it interests me, the idea that animals, like human beings, are so much more than a function.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I've been enjoying that TV series as well, and but it's very striking how, as you say, survival of the fittest and a bit of sexual selection gets sort of most of the storyline. Occasionally, I've noticed though there is a remark or two that even David Attenborough allows himself a sort of high priest of Darwinian orthodoxy, much as we love him. So there was a scene once in one episode with an elephant, and the story was about elephant rescue, and the commentator who'd been looking after the elephants talked about he feels maybe the elephants have forgiven human beings for the way that they have been so harassed. And you know, it was a great moment actually, and felt suddenly it brought a whole new sense of liveliness to the program for me actually, although the programs are so beautifully filmed. But that's what always strikes me about natural history programs, and even, you know, programs about physics and so on as well, is that whilst there is this strict orthodoxy that everything's got to be instrumental or utilitarian about survival, you know, blind mechanisms and so on, the programs themselves, they completely trade on beauty. They're so gorgeously shot. The aesthetics is doing far more work in the program than the explanations. And I feel this kind of gives the lie to that very narrow account of the world around us. It's like when the scientists stop talking amongst themselves, i.e., amongst people that have bought this orthodoxy, suddenly they have to start drawing in the rest of life again and using that to convey the tremendousness of these things. So that's to say something about exaptation. And the thought when I looked it up that came to me was actually Stephen Jay Gould, the great popular biologist writer on these things. And he talked about spandrels as an example of this. So this is the kind of triangular shape form between arches that is a byproduct of the structural shape of the arch for holding weight, but nonetheless in a building with architectural interest becomes really, really important for the beauty of the building, even though it's supposedly extraneous and not necessary. Now, there's something very uneasy about this sort of nod to the aesthetics and then discarding it in the next moment, because, you know, if you really take that seriously, it's very dehumanizing, and maybe even is taking something from life itself. It's making biology life blind, as the wonderful philosopher of science Mary Midgley used to say. This very utilitarian driven account of things has this strange byproduct of rather losing contact with life as we actually experience it. And so whilst exaptation, maybe even the slightly complicated technical sounding word, I get why it's come about, but maybe the slight uneasiness certainly that I feel around it, because of this quality of somehow denying that which actually is most important to us, is saying something important about the limitations of a strictly orthodox Darwinianism, which of course is being challenged by plenty actually of mainstream evolutionary biologists now as well. I keep close tabs on the work of Simon Conway Morris, an evolutionary biologist at Cambridge, and he has pointed out that evolution finds what he calls the same solutions time and time and time again, convergences in different creatures, also, all different levels of the natural world. And this rather starts to imply that there are not just good solutions, but maybe there's even a kind of purpose, a kind of direction of travel, particularly when you weave in the findings of systems biology, epigenetics. Even now, the remarkable thing that a cell can recode its DNA itself as it needs it. Information is sometimes talked about as the basis for life, and for even maybe for the physical world as well. And all these kind of qualities, that which seemed optional extras, starts to become actually part of the process. And so I think that things are on the move here, and that there's a reason why science needs its beauty. It's not just an optional extra; it's because it actually is part of the process somehow, which we're beginning to discover.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. I want to pick up on that phrase optional extra that you used there a couple of times to link to mistletoe, which is one of the things that's just been put in the chat. We had holy wisdom before and a comment on the holy fool, but I'm going to distort those and connect mistletoe to holly wisdom and holly fool. So we've got the holly and mistletoe. And just to say, yeah, if you're just joining the Philosophy Slam now, the idea is that Mark and I respond to words, any word that you put in the chat, and we try and say something about it. So far, we've had ritual, planet, exaptations, sophia, holy wisdom, and we are going on now to the notion of mistletoe. And now, mistletoe interests me, part because of the kissing maybe, but because I recently learned, or I was informed, that mistletoe is actually a parasite in the kind of animal world. It exists, I suppose, a bit like ivy for that matter, speaking of holly, at the expense of other trees. So it sort of forms its clusters, if that's the right word, its bunches, in the branches of certain other trees. Now, I'm clearly going a bit off piste here, but I do want to talk about this notion of the parasite as the optional extra. So contrary, we romanticize mistletoe, but apparently, it does live off and can destroy other organisms, other trees. And the reason it interests me is that there's, Mark, I love this French philosopher called Jacques Derrida, and there's a very interesting essay by him on the parasite, the host and parasite. And in a kind of classic Derrida type move, he tries to, or at least seeks to, reverse the relationship between the two, because we typically, we think of there's a host and there's the parasite that feeds off it. So if we, have a tapeworm or something disgusting like that, then that's living off the human organism. Or if you think again of those David Attenborough shows, you see the rhino plodding through the savannah, and then on its back will be birds picking off parasites. So there's parasites on parasites. So you've got the kind of layering, really, of parasites. Anyway, what Derrida, without going into the minutiae of his argument, sort of says is, well, it's better to think of, not that he talks about rhinos and so on, but it's better to think of hosts coming into the world on condition that there will be parasites, because the parasites actually help to keep them clean or do them a service in some way. So rather than thinking about the host coming first and the parasite coming second, it's as if the thought of the parasite precedes the existence of the host in some way. So there's some kind of reversal. And again, this is a common trope in Derrida, because he's again and again saying whatever we think is the kind of master term in any sort of frame of reference usually relies on its opposite, to a huge degree. It's a bit like Hegel's notion of the dialectic. The most famous example is the master and the slave, which is a bit like a parasitic relationship, whereby actually the master only becomes a master insofar as the slave recognizes the master as master. So the master needs the slave and can only really come into existence as a master predicated on the existence of a slave. So that in that sense, philosophically speaking, the slave precedes the master, and the the parasite precedes the host. So that's my little disquisition on mistletoe.
Well, look, let me pick up on that, because I wonder whether this is at least in part a Derridean kind of thought, because I like the notion of mistletoe, and indeed the other plants like the holly you mentioned, which seem to come alive at this time of year. Because I think what happens is that with the darkness in northern hemispheres being so palpably felt because it creeps in on the daylight so much, we are taking ourselves to a kind of liminal space in our imaginations, and all the old stories often associated with plants, but also associated with fairies or with angels, or other small creatures and beings, they seem to come back to our minds this time of year. And this is why I'm wondering if it is a bit linked with Jacques Derrida, is that I think what's happening is that the neat boundaries between the subject and the object, you might say that is a bit like neat boundaries between light and darkness, start to get a bit blurred. And we realize that actually all the time they were blurred, and that our imaginations are as much responsible for what shows up in the world as empirical observation. The two are always interwoven and working together. And so that might even mean that the things which our forebears, we might be inclined to say, imagined, are actually something which was perceivable to them because they didn't have such a strong sense of the dualistic separation between self and other, that which the light of science understands as opposed to the sort of darkness of the occult, or just these old traditions. I was reading an essay by the novelist Sally Vickers just recently, who often has angels in her novels. And she said that she feels this is really important now because it's a kind of reminder that when we look at the world might be looking back at us, and that learning about that relationship afresh maybe is why these traditions like mistletoe and holly and so on don't die. I mean, if anything, they get a bit stronger, it seems, partly no doubt because they're co-opted for commercial ends, but nonetheless maybe there is also something within our spirit that is reaching out afresh for these old traditions, and at this time of year where the very season helps us, and we're really rather glad of it.
That's brilliant, Mark. And I want to pick up on angels and fairies, angels on top of the Christmas tree, fairies. But also just to say, you're welcome to put any word in the chat, even if you've already put one in, you're welcome to add another one. What have we got here? Oh, Yuletide. Yes, so we've got some Christmassy ones coming in. Put whatever, any word you like in the chat. It can be on any subject. It doesn't have to be serious. It doesn't have to be seasonal, whatever you like. But I really like what you just said there about this liminal space, really, between the real and the imaginary, I suppose. My youngest daughter is studying T.S. Eliot at the moment, in A-level, and we were looking at the source material for the Wasteland, which is T.S. Eliot's most famous poem. And what Eliot says is the key influence on him is a book called From Ritual to Romance, and he's also massively influenced at the same time by a work called The Golden Bough, which came out 100 years ago, a bit more than 100 years ago, which is a sort of cataloguing of ancient myth and ritual. And there's a connection between these two books in that they talk about, I think, what you're saying there, Mark, particularly in Fraser, actually, this idea that there are spirits around us that can be that are kind of there, partly because they're there, but partly because we conjure them. There's an interplay between these two facets, as if there is the world of science, modern science at least, has kind of ruled these things out. But actually, not only are they there, but we're sort of in communion with them in some way. If we could just tune in a bit better. And Fraser also talks a lot about these spirits being related very much to places. So there'll be in modern in Catholicism, for example, there'll be a saint related to a particular place, for example. But there'll also be gods associated with particular nooks in hillsides, or by particularly, around streams and goddesses, river goddesses, and so on. And I find that, fascinating, that there is this intermediary world of interconnection, and that there is a kind of intermediary language that we somehow no longer speak. Perhaps we still think poetry occupies that space. Maybe the language of ritual, to go back to our first word, is where we begin to speak that language a bit. But I find it fascinating that there might be that intermediary realm, as you say, which is neither black nor white, neither quite living nor dead.
Well, we've had 2 or 3 other words which feel not unrelated. We've had individuation, surrealism, and sapphire. I might just pick up on sapphire because we were talking earlier about different qualities of light and how that stirs different kinds of consciousness within us, which maybe is partly what is within the notion that different stellar bodies, different planetary spheres might influence us. And of course, that can be extended to crystals and stones as well. And I was actually recently talking to someone about the quality of blue light, and how in a number of different traditions, visualizations that involve particularly sapphire light are said to have healing properties. A very typical visualization, you find it in certain kinds of Buddhism. You find it too, actually, in modern forms of psychotherapy that are very interested in the subtle energy that might move around the body. You imagine a sort of vortex spinning, and you can imagine this vortex moving perhaps through your body, or maybe spinning above your head. And according to the different quality of light that you give to the vortex, the idea is it has different impacts upon the subtle body. And blue sapphire light, maybe you imagine it raining down on you even as the vortex is spinning. It has a kind of cleansing effect. And the idea is it frees different parts of the energetic body, a bit like a sort of a blue shower or something like that. And it makes sense. I'm sure it's part of the reason why the sapphire sky is so appealing to us, and has a sort of cleansing effect. If you look up into the sky on a beautiful blue day, you want to sort of take a big breath and absorb it, and let it somehow influence and rain on you. But these visualizations can be very powerful, I think, and you can interpret it in one way as pure psychology. But I'm very open to the idea that blueness, sapphire, as well as all different kinds of light, might have this reality to them because of this in-between zone which you were mentioning there. I mean, I believe that it's well proven, actually, that patients in hospitals who can look on green out of the window, ideally a living form of greenness, a tree or grass, they need less analgesic and less painkillers, and they're in and out of the ward more quickly. So there's some wonderful sides to this in-between world that we're touching on this evening.
Yeah, that's brilliant, Mark. I'm going to go on. I'm going to try and link individuation and surrealism, actually, because that's two new words we've got in the chat. And if you want to add any more words in the chat, please just type them in there. So surrealism, most associated probably with Salvador Dali. I mean, there were others, Buñuel and others, but probably Salvador Dali is the kind of doyen of the surrealist movement. And one of the things we associate with Dali's surrealism is a kind of oniric or a landscape of dreams, kind of dream imagery, weird and wonderful things that wouldn't normally appear. So, famously, he has the soft clocks sort of folded over the arms of trees. Although apparently that came from a conversation with his wife, Gala. I think she really had the idea and he kind of adapted it. And then he wrote in his notebook, I have had, what did he call it? I've had an amazing thought about the philosophy of the super soft, I think. And it was something to do with combining the notion of a clock with a camembert, I think, which is how you got this kind of soft clock. Anyway, point is, it's a kind of dreamscape. And clearly there's a long tradition that relates art to dreams. But I think surrealism is one of the ones which one of kind of modern versions of a kind of art movement, which really places dreams as a kind of extreme form of the imagination, perhaps, center stage as a kind of valid resource to be mined in art. And I think it's connected to individuation in the following way. First of all, I mean, often we think, well, sometimes we think of Jung as a key figure in the notion of individuation, becoming a self. But we have, there are plenty of antecedents to Jung. I was thinking of Nietzsche as well. But I was wondering, actually, if one of the ways in which we do individuate is by listening to our dreams. Because in a way, although Jung will say dreams are also a reservoir of shared imagery, he's thinking about archetypes, which is famous. I think dreams are also sometimes the things which separate us most or demonstrate the specificity of our psyche more than anything else. So when we speak during the day in ordinary language, can I have a cup of coffee? How are you? That language is pretty generic or quite formulaic, a lot of the language that we use. Whereas in a dream, all sorts of primarily imagistic rather than linguistic combinations and creations and chimeras are thrown up. And in a way, I'd be surprised beyond a few generic dreams, the dream of being naked, which is very common, the dream of taking an exam, which is very common, whether there are that many dreams which are repeated, actually. I imagine there's the repertoire of world dreams features, a few standard ones, maybe at the top end, but then oodles, gazillions of highly specific, very individual, bizarre, non sequitur narratives. And whatever we take them to mean, I think they are artifacts of individuation. They are, this belongs to me. Nobody else could have dreamed the dream that I dreamed last night. So there's my attempt at jimmying together two words that have come up.
No, I like it very much. You reminded me right at the end there, when I was having my own analysis. One of the sort of shock moments for me was when I'd had a dream and I was a bit resistant to its content, and my analyst went, "Well, it came from your psyche, And I was like, "No." It was a wonderful moment for me. But I think that's right, and it's very interesting you're talking about dreams there and their specificity, because I'm sure that's right, and even one maybe that includes nakedness in public. Okay, it's borrowing from a kind of cultural trope, but nonetheless, what it means to the individual will still be particular, and that particularity is crucial, I think, to the individuating power of dreams. Sometimes people do look up the meaning of dreams in dream books, and I know you're interested in the tarot, and Meditations on the Tarot is a book that takes a lot of these symbols that can appear in dreams and also appear on the tarot cards, and that can be illuminating. It can sort of help you unpack what the meaning of the dream might be, but you've got to still connect it to where it's felt and alive for you. There's that slight quality of numinosity, as if you've been spoken to from the other side. Because that, for Jung, is what individuation really is about. It's about the bringing together of the whole of ourselves, and not just trying to hide, secure within the conscious part of ourselves that we feel we know, that we feel secure, makes us feel we're familiar with the world and life. Individuation is about stepping into the shadows, as it's sometimes put as well, because that is part of us. But what you find if you do that, Jung promised, is that actually it's releasing of energy, because staying in the narrow part of your daylight world actually is rather exhausting, and it's why it is inclined to bring up trouble, maybe neuroses, tics and habits and so on. That's the psychic energy that's required to sort of push out that which lies beyond what you can immediately understand and relate to. And why individuation, perhaps it happens more in the second part of life, because then you realize that all that ego work has achieved so much, it's not worthless. We need to have a place to be in the world, but nonetheless it's not enough, because it's not all of us. And so as life becomes a bit more frail, we're realizing, as Jung put it, that the sun is no longer rising in the sky, but it's starting to fall. this wider individuation process can really kick in, and it's frightening. I mean, it is scary, but it is also potentially expansive.
I wonder what people think, Mark. I mean, we're talking about crystals, we're talking about fairies, we're talking about blue light energies, and people think we're a pair of old hippies. But and now I'm going to talk about tarot. So that's just going to. We'll have to get, before we finish, we must talk about logical positivism, Wittgenstein, the Tractatus, or something like that.
We could do that too.
We'll do that too. Yeah, we must.
Well, someone put wolf in the comments, so we should mention wolf. We should honour the wolf.
We should also honour the wolf, indeed, and indeed Virginia Woolf.
Well,
let me say something briefly about tarot. I am quite interested in tarot. I'm no expert, but I did have I kind of got a brief sort of bit of learning, I suppose, from a tarot master during the summer. And what I hadn't realised about the tarot, although anybody who knows tarot probably knows this already, that the idea is that it's not, these aren't just a series of cards to divine your fate or tell your fortune, but they are actually a guide to a journey. And the journey is the journey of the Fool. So the cards are numbered, and the Fool is number 0. And the Fool is one of the most interesting characters in the tarot, so in the major deck, or the major arcana as they're called, because the Fool is pictured kind of stepping off a cliff. And the idea, this is a very good sort of demonstration of human beings being open to experience. So he's a fool insofar as he's stepping out, but he's kind of wise, to go back to our earlier thought, in that he's being open to experience. Anyway, his journey passes through these, like stations of the cross almost, passes through these 21, I think it is, 21 other cards, moments. And for each one you can see, there's a developmental point as to why you go from that one to that one to that one. So for example, 3 that are together, there is the Hanged Man, followed by Death, which is not the end, followed by Temperance. So why on earth would you put those 3 together? Why is that an important psychic journey to take? And Mark, I know you've written about Dante, so you're interested in these kind of psychic journeys that the soul can take. But in the tarot, it's interesting because the Hanged Man essentially is the position of the martyr, the person who experiences self-pity. Poor old me, I'm suffering. And there's a reference there to Christ, of course, on the cross, the Hanged Man. Poor me. We often go through phases, I certainly often go through phases of self-pity where I think, the world's against me, woe betide, blah, blah, blah. But actually, then the next step to get out of that, we have to go to a picture of death. So that's the next place to go. And what death is in the tarot is actually letting go. It's a shedding of stuff. And in this case, particularly the kind of self-regarding, self-pitying, self-obsessed phase that we often get stuck in. So death is, to put it in psychological terms, basically death of the ego. And then the next one after that is temperance, which sounds a bit puritanical. What it means is actually we've just taken our balanced view of the world, that things are neither kind of completely terrible for you nor completely brilliant, but you are now just recalibrating to see the world in its different hues rather than committing to one version or the other. So I find that quite fascinating, actually, the kind of developmental notion of the fool's journey, the kind of metempsychosis of that that's implicit in that tarot pack. Yeah, no,
it's really good because it's like a kaleidoscope with a sort of twist, and suddenly the light and the shade looks very, very different. And I think that there's something about that seemingly random effect of lifting the cards and then spending time with the symbolism that can again sort of stir something within you. Varlis, who asked about that originally, said that's precisely what they were onto. So that is, I think that's absolutely right. I can see that, and it feels inviting when you say it as well. So that's indicative, I think. Should we just say something about wolves or wolf?
Yes, go for it.
Maybe from the esoteric to the sentimental. I was reading a book about dogs recently, and how they're, of course, well, they're not evolved from wolves, they've been tamed from wolves, but some very remarkable things have happened in the process. I mean, one is that dogs bark, whereas wolves don't. And so the hypothesis is that barking became a way that cross-species communication developed between the wolf becoming tamed, becoming a dog, and human beings. And even more remarkably, dogs have learnt to watch the whites of human eyes in order to understand the mood of human beings, which of course is not something that wolves even have the opportunity to do, let alone do, because they have circular eyes, not oval eyes, as we human beings have. And so, whilst again, this perhaps links back to our comments on Darwinianism, whilst no doubt wolves first started hanging out with humans because it suited their survival, and the kind of pack quality meant that the relationship between wolves and human beings maybe grew more intimate than, say, human beings and wild cats. Nonetheless, I think that there's always more going on in these interactions than perhaps you would expect. And the idea that the dog is man's best friend, that kind of deep sense of connection. Perhaps that's partly why people are still fascinated by wolves, and because there you're stepping back to link to our theme of the evening, to this kind of in-between state. Is the wolf wise, or is the wolf an enemy? Is the wolf a potential friend, or is the wolf always going to be a risk or a danger to you? And so they're very fascinating in the kind of deep mythology. So I understand from reading this wonderful book about dogs.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. And actually, just on going back for a second on tarot cards, I can't resist a little plug here, because as you know, Mark, I've made a deck of cards based on constellations, which we haven't spoken about, which are ways of sort of naming hidden dynamics in relationships, really. So maybe we'll put that in the chat. It'll be a little plug if you're interested in cards and their functions. But yes, the wolf, I'm going to say something about Virginia Woolf, actually, and conscious of time as well. So we're nearly at the hour. If there's any final word you want to put in. Oh, Neoplatonism. There we go. Wow. Okay, not bad. I wonder, I mean, in a certain sense, you can think of some of those later novels of Virginia Woolf's as kind of Neoplatonic in a way, particularly The Waves, I would have thought. Jacob's Room has a bit of it. Maybe, yeah, particularly those, because, I mean, we were talking about other ways of knowing before, but particularly that later work of Virginia Woolf seems to be saying that wherever this material is coming from, this strange sort of rolling, kind of almost undulating textual style that arises in the later Virginia Woolf, it's not necessarily coming from her. It seems to be coming from a bigger force. And I think partly why The Waves is called The Waves, because we have this kind of knowledge rolling through us of a bigger sense of things. And I think even in, a book like To the Lighthouse, which can be read as a sort of family drama, also has this sense of sort of bigger forces. Even Mrs. Dalloway, the sense of time working through that book. And maybe again, like what we were saying about ritual, that I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, you're an expert on Neoplatonism, and I'm not, but this idea that there is a knowledge that we can access, or a gnosis even, Gnosis, that we can access, that is a bit bigger than us in a slightly mystical way. And there is that mystical side of Plato that is picked up in Neoplatonism, I think.
Oh, very much so. But it's good to clarify, actually, and I do like the link you're making with Virginia Woolf there, because I think that one of the things that gets misunderstood about Neoplatonism, and indeed Plato himself, is that what he called the forms, or the ideas, in the Greek it's more like ideas, these were living qualities. They weren't kind of templates that somehow are cosmically fixed and that we then reflect or mirror or echo in some fallen way. That's a very post Francis Bacon way of understanding Plato. He quite explicitly actually reinterprets Plato in that way. But what Plato was onto, because this was the assumption in the medieval and the ancient world, is that the cosmos is quite as alive as we are, and that the ideas or forms of Platonism and then Neoplatonism are much more like sort of radiating principles, or using a modern scientific analogy, you might say strange attractors. So the form of beauty is that capacity that all things have to become beautiful, to reflect, to radiate beauty in their manifestations, in all their diversity. And as it were, the form of beauty keeps pouring beauty into the world that then appears in all these different forms. And so maybe, Wolf, I don't know how, much she'd read Neoplatonism and even what the understanding of Neoplatonism was at the time, but even in A Room of One's Own, when she comes at the end to this notion of the androgynous mind, there's something transcendent about that. She's been arguing for the need of a room, and the money to support that for women. And she has this whole very witty section really about Shakespeare's sister. And would we even know about Shakespeare's sister? And because she wouldn't have had a room of her own like her brother William. But she comes to the end to a more transcendent mood where she says, but what's really significant about the creative possibility that comes with having a room of your own, and Shakespeare is the supreme example of this, is that actually all that you have been frustrated with, that has been causing you ire, that you perhaps needed to campaign for, but no doubt coupled to revenge and envy and all these sorts of limiting qualities that we human beings can have, gets burnt away, and you become transparent to the whole of life. And so the androgynous mind is one that can just flow with and allow to flow through everything that's around us unimpeded. And of course, that's what makes for the great artist. And the notion of art and aesthetics and different voices, how a story can be so particular that it becomes universal. All these they're not a million miles away from Neoplatonic themes, actually. And yeah, so I have to look that up. Yeah.
Now, I'm conscious of time, so we should finish in a second, but the last word maybe we'll take just came in, hyperobjects. Now, my understanding of hyperobjects is that these are kind of modern day phenomenon which are so large as to be almost unthinkable. So when COVID first struck, for example, I think that would have counted as a kind of hyperobject. It was like too big, overwhelming, multifaceted, new, obscure. We couldn't quite categorize it. Was it a flu? Was it something else? We couldn't quite get our heads around it. So that's, in my recollection of the definition of a hyperobject, that's sort of what it would be. Or particularly these days, I think even, climate change, what's happening to the climate, it's like a hyperobject. It's beyond objectivity. We can't quite objectify it because it's so interconnected. It's so multifaceted. It's so plural in its in the way it presents to us that it's kind of on the verge of the unthinkable, even though we have local bits of knowledge and semi-frameworks that enable a kind of partial purchase on it. Whereas, and although it's considered, a very modern concept, the hyperobject, I don't remember who it's associated with now, Tom, somebody, anyway. I would suggest it actually has its origins, particularly in the Romantic, but also a little bit in the classical notion of the sublime. Because in the Romantic sublime, at least, particularly that of, as described by Wordsworth and Coleridge, the sublime sort of fits that criteria, something bigger than us, something we can't compute. And they even talk about the mathematical sublime. There are no numbers that quite add up to it. And in particular, what characterizes the sublime is that it's both beautiful and terrifying at the same time. And I think, in a weird way, some of these things have that quality. I mean, even COVID at the beginning, obviously it was terrifying, but there was something, the experience of it when everything just calmed down and the world was quiet again. There was a sort of beauty, actually, for a brief period in the spring 2020. I remember going for a walk in my local park, where the air was quiet, there were no planes, there was no pollution, all of that had stopped for a few weeks. And it was absolutely beautiful. I mean, it's movingly beautiful, predicated on something terrifying. So I think, that's for me, that's the hyper object. But I think it has its origins actually in the sublime, and I think we'll continue to experience more and more due to things like climate change. Actually, so anyway, quick word there on the
Yeah,
hyper
look,
object.
final thought from me.
Yeah.
We'll have to draw to a close. Someone's put in numinous, but maybe the numinous is nudging its way into the felt quality of what you're saying already. But yeah, I mean, I like what you're saying about linking hyper objects back. Actually, is it Timothy Morton? Is that the
Yes,
philosopher?
Tim
Yeah.
Morton. Yeah, that's right.
I mean, I appreciate what things are trying to do, but I can't help but feel there's a bit of the vanity of postmodernity in it as well, as if suddenly we're experiencing things that have never been experienced before, and having to make up words. There's the magazine that has the sort of Sude's Corner, and one of the things which they can do is put in words like, I don't know, quality time, formerly known as time. And I sometimes think that this reaching after new words, often by putting prefixes in front of old words, is an attempt to sort of control the situation, and maybe going back to the older understanding of multifaceted problems and things that the mind couldn't grasp. Maybe to link right back to where we started this evening, through ritual as much as anything else. That perhaps is the way to go, rather than this sort of increasingly, um, I don't know, difficult abstract notions like hyperobject.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, thanks, Robert. We should draw to a close.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah.
We've covered some ground, a bit suitable for the time of year, mistletoe, and we got a bit in between as well with various notions. But we came into individuation and surrealism and these kind of psychological notions, as well as Jack Derrida coming to the rescue and at least keeping us philosophical in some parts, since we do advertise this as a philosophy slam. Although, again, I rather like old notions of philosophy that was much, much more expansive than how it can be thought about today. But thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark. And Mark, you and I, we must do our plug. We've got to become social media experts and plug our material. So Mark and I, as well as doing our online philosophy slam, we also do the slam in person, principally in London around various members clubs. So do come and see us. You can look at our website, philosophyslam.net, and you can buy tickets and come and see us, meet us in person. Mark has an amazing website, markvernon.com, isn't it, Mark? Where you can see all his publications. And he's working on a book on Blake at the moment, but written recently on Dante, on spiritual intelligence, on Owen Barfield, all sorts of things. So do have a look at his website. Look at mine, robertrowlandsmith.com. Yeah, and if you are interested in things like tarot and card decks, have a look at this amazing card deck I've created called Simple Truths. So that's simple-truths.org as well. So please follow us, like and subscribe this video, subscribe to Mark's channel, and do all of those good things, because we are trying to be good social media citizens, aren't we, Mark?
And watch out for the next Philosophy Slam online, which will be in the new year. Thanks, Robert. Speak to you before then, but certainly then as well.
Take care. Thank you, everybody.